Welcome back to the class. In this lesson, we're going to tackle the typography for our landing page. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means choosing the right typefaces and all of the other text properties to make sure that everything looks nice and neat. That means font sizes, line heights, font weights, and so on and so forth. I'm also going to be showing you some very helpful tools that are going to make your job a lot easier, and we'll also discuss typographic scales, and I'm going to give you an introduction to the 8-point grid system we'll be using throughout this design process. So let's begin. We begin here in the starter Figma file under typography, where I've created a few frames for defining typefaces, the type scale, the heading styles, the style for the block quotes, and the paragraphs. This is enough to get you going. So let's move on to defining the headings. To do that, we'll start by taking a look at the project brief. So right at the end, under design considerations, the client asks us to make the landing page modern, professional, yet playful. So how does that translate to the typography? Well, the playful part we can actually get from the colors, right? When we make it colorful, we make it playful. But this bit, make it modern and professional, we can totally do that with the help of typography. So when starting a project like this, it's always a good idea to visit the websites that you use to get your font files. There are a lot of them. I use two of them mainly, Adobe Fonts and Google Fonts. Now, Google Fonts is free, and Adobe Fonts, well, you need to have an Adobe subscription to get access to these. But I will say this, Adobe has much higher quality typefaces than Google. You can still find great typefaces here, but usually I reach out for Adobe fonts because they just are a little bit more refined, and the collection here is actually much bigger than what you would find on Google Fonts. And because I have an Adobe subscription, it just makes sense for me to use their fonts. So now, because the client asked us to make the landing page look modern, we're going to use a sans serif typeface. What is a sans serif typeface? Well, let me give you an example. And I'm going to open up Roboto here. And actually, no, I'm just going to make this really big so you can see the difference. A sans serif is a typeface that doesn't have the serifs on the letters. And I think actually I should start with a serif typeface so you can see the difference. Okay, this is a serif typeface. See these decorations here, and also here, and also here? These are called serifs. And serifs are usually found on older typefaces. The more modern typefaces are sans serif, or without serif. Okay? Just like this one. So here, see here, we don't have those decorations anymore. We can find them here or here or here. These are cleaner and more modern. Now, I won't go over serif versus sans serif in this class. That's beyond the scope. But if at some point a client asks you, okay, we want a modern looking website, then as far as typography is concerned, you need to use sans serif typefaces. Now, in my case, after doing a little bit of digging around on Adobe Fonts, I've settled for Brandon Grotesque. This is a typeface that fits both criteria. It's modern, it's sans serif, and it's also very professional looking. And it also has all of these styles. We have styles or weights ranging from thin to light to regular to black. So this is the one that we're going to use for the headings and some of the other elements. Now, when it comes to the body text, we're going to be using Tisa Sans Pro, or FF Tisa Sans as it's called here. This is a typeface that's similar to Brandon Grotesque, but obviously it has its own differences. And I'm using two typefaces because while Brandon Grotesque is great for headings, so it's great in large font sizes, it doesn't do that well on smaller body text. And for that reason, I'm using FF Tisa Sans or Tisa Sans Pro. This will work great on smaller text sizes, like for example 18. When we're doing the body text, this will perform beautifully. Now, these are my choices. Your choices might vary, and I strongly suggest you do a little bit of digging around either on Adobe Fonts or Google Fonts and find the typefaces that you think look best and go ahead and use those. In my case, I have both of these fonts installed on my system. So all I got to do now is go in here in Figma and reference them. So I'm going to say Brandon Grotesque, and I'm going to go right here under text, and I'm going to select Brandon Grotesque. Let's make this bold, and let's use a bigger font size, maybe like 55. And what I usually do, and let me just move these out of the way, I usually duplicate these values and I just highlight or present all the weights for this typeface. So this is regular, this is medium, bold, and this is black. And this just gives me an idea of how the typeface looks like without having to change a piece of text manually. I can just, like for example, if I'm in main design, I can just come into typography and I can say, okay, so this is what the lightest version of it looks like, or this is how the heaviest version of it looks like. So let's go ahead and do the same for the body text. We're using Tisa Sans Pro, and I'm going to do exactly the same here. This has a couple of versions as well, starting from thin, light. Well, actually, these are the other way around. Regular, and then medium, bold, extra bold, and black. All right, so now we have our typefaces ready to go. And by the way, to zoom in like this, you can hold Command on Mac and just use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out. Or on Windows, you can use Control and the mouse wheel to do the same thing. And since we're on the topic of zooming in and out, let me show you two other keyboard shortcuts I use all the time. Shift 0 will always zoom to 100%, regardless of Mac or Windows. Shift 1 will zoom to fit. So it's going to take all of your frames and it's going to fit them in the visible portion of your canvas. And if you select an element or a frame and you press Shift 2, it's going to zoom to selection. These are three keyboard shortcuts that I use all the time. So again, Shift 0 is zoom to 100%, Shift 1 zoom to fit, Shift 2 zoom to selection. And holding down Command on Mac or Control on Windows will basically allow you to use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out. Pretty cool, right? Now, let's move on to the type scale. Now, what is a typographic scale? Well, the easiest way to explain is to show you. Here we have a website that I use all the time. It's called typescale.com. And here, what you do is basically you set your base font size, you select a scale, and that will give you a list of font sizes that you need to use to create this harmonious scale. So if I were to change the ratio here, you will see that the scale changes as well. And by using this tool, you can say, okay, this is what I'm going to use for heading 1, heading 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And this is what I use for smaller text. By using this tool, I make sure that my typography is always spot on, because without it, you don't really know what kind of font sizes to use, right? I mean, you start with, let's say, the base font size for the body text, which is usually 16 pixels. But what about after that? What do you use for the H1 or the H3? Do you use 20 pixels or do you use 21 pixels? Or maybe you use whatever you think looks best. That can work, but having a tool like this that tells you exactly what kind of or what font sizes to use based on a scale is critical. And the way this works is actually very simple. Now let me open a calculator and explain the principle behind this. So a type scale works based on a ratio. We start with the base value, which is 16 pixels. That base value we multiply by the scale, which in our case is 1.414. And that gives us the result 22.624. Now for the next item on the scale, we take that value, 22.624 or 22.62, we can use 2 decimal places, and we divide it or we multiply it with the same ratio, 1.414. And that will give us the next value. In our case, I actually used the wrong separator here. In our case, it's 31.98. And you do that over and over and over again until you get all the values for the rest of your text elements. Now, the advantage of using a tool like Typescale is that you don't have to make these calculations manually. It does it for you. And it does it in ems as well as in pixels. Now, because I'm using Figma, I have a handy plugin that generates type scales for me. And that plugin is called Font Scale. If you want to install it, you simply need to go to Plugins, Manage Plugin, and then search for Font Scale and install it. It's really, really simple. Now, to use this plugin, you enter the base font size. In my case, it's going to be 18, and choose the scale factor. In my case, it's going to be major third. And then generate layers. Okay, and that generated these layers, and you can actually paste them in here. And as you can see, that gives you text elements that have the correct font sizes. And it's exactly the same as going here and saying, okay, I want to use 18 pixels and 1.250 or major third. Right, that's going to give you the exact same result. The difference is in Figma, you have these layers and you can reference them at any time you want. So let's select all of these and let's change the typeface to Brandon Grotesque. There we go. Now I'm also going to add another element here because I want this final value of 55 pixels So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through each one and I'm going to round off the font size. So this is 43.95. We're going to make it 44. This is 35. This is 28. This is 22.5. So I can go either 22 or 23. Let's go with 23. This is 18. And this is 14.4, but we're going to use 14. Now, since we have the typographic scale in place, let's do a little bit of a simulation for the heading styles. So we're going to say heading 1, and we're going to multiply that to create headings from 1 through 6. And also let's do a small element here. So all of these will be using branding grotesque, and headings 1 through 3, we're going to make them bold. Heading 5, we're probably going to make this medium. Heading 6 is going to be regular, and the small we'll use uppercase. And you can open these advanced type details by clicking this little button here and choosing uppercase. And this will be set to 14 pixels. Let's do 5% letter spacing. It's going to be bold, and we should be good to go there. Now, let's define the styles, or the style for the other headings. So we have heading 1. That's going to be 55 pixels, because 55 is the font size of this element from our type scale. Heading 2 will be using 44. Heading 3 will be using 35. Then we have 28 for heading 4, 23 for heading 5, and then for heading 6, we'll be using 18, which is the base font size. And by doing this, we've basically defined the font sizes for all our headings based on this type scale. Pretty cool, right? And very, very easy. So let's go ahead and move this. And since we're on the topic of defining styles, let's define a style for the block quotes. And here we'll be using also branding grotesque, and we're going to be using the 35 pixel font size. Okay, let's move that out of the way. And finally, let's set a style for the paragraphs. These will be using Tisa Sans Pro regular 18 pixels. All right, so now our typography is pretty much set up. The final thing that we have to do is set the proper line heights. Now, to do that, we're going to be working with the 8-point grid system. So let me tell you a little bit about this. There's a great article that I linked in the resources PDF file. So go ahead and check that out. It really explains why it's beneficial to use the 8-point grid system in web design. Essentially, what we're trying to do is achieve a consistent vertical rhythm. So any measurement or any distance, any margin or padding that we're going to apply, any height that we're going to apply to our elements should be a multiple of 8. That applies to the text elements as well. The font size doesn't necessarily have to be a multiple of 8. What matters is the line height is a multiple of 8, because the line height dictates how tall the lines of text are. And if there are multiples of 8, then everything is going to fall nicely on a baseline grid. I'm going to show you a little bit about that when we get to the when we add more elements and we follow this 8-point grid system. But for now, what you should know is that when it comes to typography, we're going to set the line height of the text elements to be a multiple of 8. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Heading 1 has a line height that should be around 79 pixels. This is automatically calculated by Figma, so I'm going to set it to 80 pixels. Heading 2 should be around 63. Well, the next or the closest multiple of 8 is 64, so we'll do that. Heading 3 is 50. So here we can go either 48, that's a multiple of 8, or we can go with 56. So let's do that, 56. Heading 4 is 40, so that's spot on. Heading 5 is 36, and we can go with either 40 or 32. So let's go 32. Heading 6 is 18. We can go 24 here, and this one we can go 24 as well. Okay, so that's the line height set for the headings. Now for the block quotes, let's see, 35, we're going to use 56 because that's what we used here as well. But if you feel like this is too much, and now that I actually see it, I might just revert back to 48. And I think that looks a little bit better. So let's do that here as well, 48. And by the way, these are not final. You can always change these if you get to the design point and you find that, well, this doesn't really work that well. You can always come back to this and change. It's not a big deal. And paragraphs, 18, we're going to use 24 as a line height. And with that, we've created the typography characteristics for our landing page. All right, if you've been working alongside me, then you should have the typography all figured out. If not, go ahead and do that right now. And just like with colors, experiment a little bit. You don't have to use the same typefaces that I used or the same scale that I did. Pick a typeface or pick the 2 typefaces that you think work best for this kind of product or for this kind of project. It doesn't matter if it's a free or a paid typeface. If you think it looks good, go ahead and use it. Also, you don't have to use the same 1.25 scale that I used. Play around with them. Pick one that you think looks best. And when choosing the different ratios, notice how these affect the overall composition of those text elements. See how this changes the visual hierarchy in the page. You'll see that the lower the ratio, the less difference it is between each step in the scale. The higher the ratio, the higher the difference between each step in the scale. So for example, if you're going with a golden ratio, you'll see that there's a dramatic difference between the smaller font sizes and the larger font sizes. Each type scale, each ratio has its place for different things. You would use smaller ratios for blogs, maybe, or for maybe a dashboard, where you don't need such a big difference between font sizes. And you would use something like the golden ratio when you want to make a statement, when you have a website with big, bold typography, right? When you have a big difference between the body text and the largest heading. So play around with these, and once you're done, you're ready to move on to the next lesson, which is about images and other visual assets like icons. Now we're going to be using some placeholder images, and even though these are not final, at least they give us a starting point. So that's coming up in the next lesson. I'll see you there.